Hi, this is Remembering the Past, the show where we talk about people who've died recently who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. Tonight we're going to start with our feature, Nell Harper Lee, better known as Harper Lee, who died recently at the age of 89. She was the author of one of the seminal books of the 20th century, the novel To Kill a Mockingbird. It's based on her life growing up in Monroeville, Alabama in the 1930s, and it's a tale of how her father, the small-town lawyer in Macon, Alabama, which is based on Monroeville, defends a black man who's falsely accused of rape by a young woman from the town. The narrator Scout is based on her. The novel's father, Atticus, is based on her father. The side characters, a young neighbor who's her friend named Dill, was based on Truman Capote, who was actually one of her neighbors at the time. Because of its coming-of-age story and dealing with race relations, it's one of the most iconic books in American history, well acclaimed and a staple in almost every American high school or junior high school. It was written in 1960 when race relations were turning in the United States. That had something to do with its popularity. Won the Pulitzer Prize in 1961, and it was made into an extremely popular movie in 1962, starring Gregory Pack giving one of the iconic performances in American history as Atticus, Mary Badham as Scout. It's got the young John Magna as Dill. He was so creepy in Hitchcock's The Magic Shop a couple years later. And it features an early performance by a young Robert Duvall. Here's a clip from the movie with Gregory Peck as a legendary Atticus and Mary Badham as Scout.
But if I keep going to school, we can't ever read anymore.
Scout, you know what a compromise is?
Bending the law?
No. It's an agreement reached by mutual consent. Here's the way it works. You concede the necessity of going to school. We'll keep right on reading the same every night, just as we always have. Is that a bargain?
There just didn't seem to be anyone or anything Atticus couldn't explain. Though it wasn't a talent that would arouse the admiration of any of our friends, Jem and I had to admit he was very good at that.
Yeah, I got a soft spot for Gregory Peck there. In 1966, I got to play Atticus in the trial scene at To Kill a Mockingbird in our 7th grade presentation. As I said, Harper Lee was friends with Truman Capote, and later in life she actually helped him research In Cold Blood. And this is depicted in the movie Capote with Philip Seymour Hoffman, whose podcast we've done, and Catherine Keener. They meet on a train out to Kansas to start researching the Clutter murders for In Cold Blood.
I figured you missed it.
I'm sorry.
That's all right. I thought I was heading to Kansas by myself.
God, I'm glad you agreed to come. You're the only one I know with the qualifications to be both a research assistant and a personal bodyguard.
Thank you.
I'm nervous. Yes?
Mr. Truman Capote and Miss Nell Harper Lee.
That's us.
Would you like these, sir?
You can put that right there between the doors.
What did you bring?
Just a few things.
Thank you greatly, sir.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes. It's an honor to have you with us, sir, and hope you won't mind me saying, but I thought your last book was even better than the first. Just when you think they've gotten as good as they can get.
Thank you very much.
Ma'am.
You're pathetic.
What?
You paid him to say that.
How did you know?
Just when you think they've gotten as good as they can get.
I thought that was a good line. Do you think that was too much?
A little bit.
Here's a literary critic, Michael Goldfarb, talking to BBC4 about Harper Lee.
It is quite an amazing thing, the Harper Lee phenomenon. For a lot of us who were young and just coming into serious fiction, we had seen that film with Gregory Peck as Atticus Finch. He projected this sense of nobility and liberal sentiment, and I think that she just caught the right moment in American life. The book was published in 1960, a few months before John F. Kennedy would be elected president, and it just caught a whole wave about change in the South, about treating people with dignity. It carried on a certain kind of American self-belief that came out of World War II.
Harper Lee never wrote anything like To Kill a Mockingbird again. Who could? They dug up some prequel that she wrote called Ghosts at a Watchman, supposedly before Mockingbird. They dug it up in 2015 when she was very old, and there are a lot of hinky circumstances there with the publishers and agents and all, but she basically became a recluse, and here's Michael Goldfarb to talk about that.
Success for American authors can be an overwhelming thing. She was a very, very shy woman. She didn't like the publicity that came with it. Perhaps she only had the one book in her. Her friend Truman Capote, his greatest book, In Cold Blood, on which Harper Lee worked as his research assistant, never reached those heights again after he published that book, about 7 years after Harper Lee published To Kill a Mockingbird. I think it's very difficult to become a cultural celebrity in America, particularly in 1960. People just didn't expect to be on the cover of magazines. Authors didn't. And I think that it overwhelmed her completely. And then, of course, the harder she found to write a sequel, the more the pressures probably seeped into her small-town life in Alabama and made it difficult.
We're going to move on now to William Tankersley, who died recently at the age of 98. He was the CBS censor for William Paley and Frank Stanton in the early years of television. He started in the early 50s and lasted until 1972, so he oversaw a complete overhaul of standards in television broadcasting, sexual, social, and political. From the days when Lucy and Ricky couldn't sleep in the same bed, to the days when Laura and Rob couldn't sleep in the same bed, to the days when Archie Bunker could use slurs on television and flush a toilet on television, to the days when Ma talked about an abortion. William Tankersley presided over all that, but his biggest problem is with the Smothers Brothers. Smothers Brothers were a folk singing duo that had a comedy hour on CBS in the late 60s. They put in all sorts of irreverent stuff that irritated sponsors and outlets, especially about the Vietnam War, very anti-Vietnam stuff, drug references, anti-religious references, and ultimately they were taken off. We talked a little bit about this when we did the Pete Seeger podcast because they brought him back to sing Waist Deep in the Big Muddy, a controversial song about the Vietnam War. The cast that got their contract terminated had the comedian David Steinberg doing a religious sermon, and here's their version of it, and then William Tankersley's version of it.
From Television City in Hollywood, ladies and gentlemen, meet the Smothers Brothers.
This comedy hour was scheduled to air April 13th, 1969. CBS never, ever aired this show. That's right. And our guests on the show that was never aired were Laugh-In's Dan Rowan, comedian David Steinberg, and singer Nancy Wilson. This comedy hour actually is one of my most memorable shows. And that's because this is the comedy hour that supposedly got us fired. That's right. This was the second time David Steinberg performed a satirical religious sermon on the show. The first time David performed one of his sermons on the show, CBS got hundreds of negative letters, actually. So they were wary of having him back on the show again, and of course we had him on the show and asked him to do a second sermon. And it went over so well with the network. So the second sermon they used as an excuse to fire the Smothers Brothers. Back in October 27th, I think, last year, we had a young man, David Steinberg, on the show who did a sermonette along with the New Day Singers, a Jesuit seminary group. And we had a great deal of problems from that telecast. It was all intended in fun. But we have Mr. Steinberg back with us again. We think he's one of the truly fine comedians and writers in the business. And he's going to do now another sermonette. Now, we don't want to offend anybody out there, but if you get offended, that's the way the cookie crumbles. Ladies and gentlemen, very talented man with his sermon, Mr. David Steinberg.
Will the congregation please be seated for this evening's sermon? Tonight's sermon deals with the exciting personalities of Solomon, Lot, and Jonah, all of whom had a wonderful rapport with God, whom I'm sure you'll all remember from last week's sermon. When Solomon was appointed king, God appeared to him in a dream and said, Solomon, now that you're king, you can have anything that your heart desires. Solomon said, oh, God, grant me wisdom that I might be the wisest king of all. And God gave Solomon his anthropomorphic zap. Solomon became all wise and knowing, and at that moment he knew he should have asked for money.
Here's William Tankersley talking about it. He actually sounds like a quite reasonable guy. The trick he refers to is the Smothers Brothers not giving a copy of their broadcast before it aired to the network.
And we had many of those things, tricks played. And Tommy, likable as he is, and I liked him, got along well with him. One night they pulled the same trick. I had a call from the West Coast, and they said, Tommy Smothers has grabbed the tape and has flown off, we think, to San Francisco. We can't send it to the affiliates. And I called our president, Bob Wood, and said, you know, I felt when we renewed them not too long ago that we should drop the contract. And this time, I tell you, Bob, we have to do it. And because they haven't really changed too much since then, they'll sue us. They may win, but they cannot continue on this network. We can't control them. So we met the next morning with the lawyers, and the program department is screaming to keep them because it's a fairly good show. It wasn't a top-rated show, it was a pretty good show. And the political thing was just too heavy. Only Tommy, the other one, never got involved. They had a party, you know, after 20 years. They came back with a show and had a celebration out there at CBS. And they called Tommy and the producer. But I considered coming out as a guest. So I talked with Tommy and I said, you're about 52 years old now, aren't you, Tommy? He said, that's right. I said, I know, because I remember you turned 32 and said you were still a kid. 52. I said, that was the very age I was when you told the press that I was this old man cracking down on you. I said, how did it feel? He stammered all over the place. But the producer, a nice guy, Ken Cragen, I guess it was, I'm not sure, laughed and said, well, would you want to? And I said, I wouldn't mind. I said, I'm not mad at them. So I went out, appeared that night. Diane Cannon cut cake for us, and we shook hands. They had set it up all right for publicity, my Lord. New York Times interviewed me, this paper interviewed me. The morning show had cameras there, my God, lined up. I didn't mind. You know, I wanted you to say they were all no good. Well, it wasn't true. They were good entertainers. I remembered when they were at Hollywood Bowl and very good and very likable. I told them that night the basic problem is that Tommy always thought I liked Dickie best. And it was true. I never even met Dickie.
Well, the Smothers Brothers won the suit. They got about $750,000, but their careers were never the same after that. Well, we're going to close tonight with the Jazz Record Mart, the venerable Chicago jazz record store that closed after 57 years. Here's an editorial on it from February 18, 2016 from the Chicago Tribune. In the inevitable clash between art and commerce, bet on commerce to prevail. That's why the inventory, website, and name of the Jazz Record Mart, the venerable downtown Chicago Emporium, billed as the world's largest jazz and blues record store, has been sold to Wolfgang's Vault, a Nevada company that restores and digitizes music. Bob Kester, who owned the Jazz Record Mart, expressed the reason for the sale prosaically: the rent is killing us. The store closed this week, but there's more to the riff. No, Chicago, this isn't the end of jazz or the blues, nor is it the end of vinyl, which paradoxically is becoming trendy again. But it may foreshadow the death of the jazz record. How, though, can such an indignity be? When Kester began selling jazz records in the 50s and established the Jazz Record Mart in 1962, owning jazz records was the epitome of cool. The popularity of jazz records in that era was the result of a number of post-war social trends coalescing. With the civil rights movement coming to the fore, white people were being exposed to jazz, which had been primarily a black art form since the 1920s. By the mid-50s, white audiences, especially affluent white audiences, familiarized themselves with the brilliance of Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, Thelonious Monk, and Miles Davis. The Newport Jazz Festival, established in 1954, quickly became a major cultural event. America's booming economy and technical advances in recording nurtured this newfound interest in jazz. Columbia and other recording companies began featuring jazz artists on platters designed for high-fidelity sound systems that offered faithful reproduction of musicians' recordings. By the early 1960s, hi-fi sound systems in the home or apartment were as much a status symbol as was driving a cool car, and jazz records were a staple of many hi-fi collections. In the early days, the Jazz Record Mart benefited from the enterprise of a fellow Chicagoan and one of America's most important jazz aficionados, Hugh Hefner. Hefner was an emerging force in publishing with Playboy, which featured comely women often photographed lounging around the hi-fi. Hefner was touting the new, sophisticated lifestyle, and jazz was essential to it. For those who read Playboy for the articles, Hefner included profiles of jazz artists and an article by jazz pianist Dave Brubeck on the new jazz audience. Hefner's most important contribution came in 1962 when he published a groundbreaking interview with Miles Davis by a little-known author, Alex Haley. The interview covered jazz, race, politics, and culture. It raised the consciousness of a new generation to jazz, and the Jazz Record Mart prospered. Today, Kester's records belong to Wolfgang's, the digital version of the dusty record store bin. Perhaps it doesn't matter. It will still be possible to download those talented jazz artists. But is our culture better off for consigning them to the dustbin of history? Will the shoppers wandering ubiquitously through suburban malls with iPod buds in their ears ever be exposed to those jazz records? If only. There's a real 99% versus 1% divide between people who have never heard the oeuvre of Billie Holiday, Ella Fitzgerald, or Louis Armstrong, and those who have. The Jazz Record Mart is gone. An appreciative subset of Chicagoans won't forget it, but many hands that once placed the stylus on the record have moved on. Well, I'm going to close on that note. I want to thank my producer and IT genius, Sid Tepps, and let's close tonight with Charlie Bird Parker doing a jazz version of George Gershwin's immortal Summertime.